Okay, morning everyone. Welcome to Breakfast with Learn again. Delighted to have Rabbi Akiva, Rosenblatt from Hadley with us this morning, one of our regulars on Zoom, but now in person. So without further ado, I invite you to say a few words.
Morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Stephen, for inviting me back. I think this is my hat trick this morning. I've spoken to you at least twice, I think, twice on Zoom. And so I must have done something not too bad to be able to be invited back. So I am currently I'm learning in the mornings the topic of chalav akum, non-Jewish milk. And I thought it might be interesting to sort of share a bit about what I've been learning with all of you. Of course, feel free to ask questions along the way. Just starting with a quick idea on this week's parasha before we jump straight into the milk issue. And that is the parasha starts with the famous verse in B'chukaisai Teilechu, V'es mitzvosai tishmeru. If you follow in my statutes and you keep my mitzvot, and so on and so forth. And as we heard from the fellow that gave the Devar this morning, the parsha continues with what will happen if you keep them and what happens if you don't. But famously, Rashi says on the very beginning of the parsha, in B'chukaisai Teilechu, if you follow in my statutes, Rashi says, Shatiyu amelim b'Torah, that people should toil in their study of Torah. It doesn't say that people should study Torah, it says that people should toil in their study of Torah, that they should work hard at the study of Torah. The question is, where does Rashi get that from? Where do you see, where is it alluded to in the verse that one shouldn't just study Torah, that one should work really hard at Torah study? And I think the simple understanding is that it doesn't say you should, it doesn't say in my statutes you should do. That's the next part of the verse. You should keep my mitzvot. It says you should walk in my statutes. And I think what this is alluding to is the fact that studying Torah is not an armchair exercise. It's something which you have to walk with. It's something which you have to get out of bed to achieve. It's something which takes work, takes effort. It's something which is a journey of sorts. It's not something which we can just sit back and relax when we do. And the truth is, the more effort we put into it, the greater the results and the better the understanding that we have. So that's the first thing I wanted to share this morning. And secondly, as well, in terms of halacha, and we'll see when we sort of get our feet wet with this. The Chafetz Chaim, the Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, the author of the famous Mishnah Brura, and also of the Chafetz Chaim, his book on Lashon Hara, talks about the fact that when people are sort of learning new halachas and learning a new topic, they get nervous. I don't want to know about what I can't do. I don't want to know all this stuff. I'm just happy with the life I lead, and that's good enough for me. And what he says actually is the opposite is true. The less you know about something, the less you can do because you don't know. I was thinking on the way here that a good sort of metaphor would be coronavirus. When we first were, face to face with this virus, we didn't know enough about the virus to know what we could do. And therefore, everything wasn't allowed. You had to quarantine for 2 weeks. Doesn't matter whether you've tested positive, doesn't matter if you've tested negative, you have to go into 2-week quarantine. Whether you've been in contact with someone who's had COVID, whether you have COVID yourself, 2-week quarantine. There's a strictness about the way you have to behave because we don't know enough about the virus. And the more we start to understand about the way it works, the more lenient you can become in terms of the way you deal with the virus. And therefore, the government then realized, actually, we don't need 2 weeks, it could be 10 days. And actually, if you've been in contact with someone, you don't have to isolate, you can test yourself instead, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the more you know about something, the more you can actually do. And the Chafetz Chaim says the same thing is true about the laws of Shabbat, which is what he's writing about. The more you know about the laws of Shabbat, the more you know what you can do. Because if you don't know about Shabbat, you think everything's wrong, you think everything's not okay. Someone in Shul last week was asking me, are we allowed to set the tables on Shabbat? It's very nice of them to be that respectful about it, but in Shul, but they said, Rabbi, do not have to set the tables for Shabbat. I said, no, it's fine, you can set tables on Shabbat. But the less you know, the more you think you can't do, and the more you know, the more you realize actually it's not as restrictive as I thought it was. So let's try and sort of delve into this topic over here. And as I said, feel free to ask questions along the way. This is not going to be an exhaustive discussion around non-Jewish milk and non-Jewish cheese, but it still, I guess, gives us a bit of a background into where the whole idea comes from. So really, just by way of introduction, the cheese story and the milk story are very different things. And let's focus on cheese first and then move on into milk. Cheese. It's a Mishnah in Avodah Zarah 29b, Chavtes Amud Beis, where the Mishnah talks about the various things which the rabbis forbade. This is a rabbinic prohibition. And one of the things which is mentioned in the Mishnah is cheese. Okay? Now, you have an interesting conversation going on in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael asked Rabbi Yeshua the following question. He said, Rabbi Yeshua, why did the rabbis forbid cheese? What's wrong with non-Jewish cheese? And he completely shrugs off the question. He deflects the question. He talks about something completely different. Doesn't answer the question at all. Strange story. Asks him the question, why is cheese not okay? And he responds to him and quotes some verse from Mishlei, I think it is, where, completely diverts his attention to something else. And the Gemara is wondering what on earth is going on over here. Why does he not answer the question? What's wrong with the seemingly pretty straightforward question? And the Gemara says, well, the reason is because whenever the rabbis whenever the Chazal made a new gezerah, whenever they made a new rule, they never gave the reason. For 12 months. For 12 months, they refused to disclose the reason behind the rule. And the simple reason is because when you start giving people the reason behind what you do, especially when it's a new concept or a new rule, people won't take too well to it because they'll say, no, that doesn't apply to me. I'll be okay. I won't get involved with that. But like when I tell my son not to do something, if I tell him don't play with matches, his question always is, why? I say, don't strike the match. And I said, why? It's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Because you can cause a fire. His response is going to be, and it is, don't worry, I'll be careful. I'll be careful. I'll make sure that it doesn't cause a fire. And obviously that's not good because he's 7 years old. He can't play with matches. And the same is true with us. If the rabbis would tell us immediately why they're coming up with the rules, then we'll turn around and say, well, that's ridiculous. I'll be careful. I won't let that happen. So what they did was, for 12 months, they said, look, we're not giving you the reason. After 12 months, we're going to share with you the reason, with the hope that because it's been 12 months and we've gotten used to doing what they've said, then it's going to be something which they're not going to fight back against and something which we'll accept more easily. So the Talmud then continues and says, okay, that's why he didn't give him the reason. But what actually is the reason for the rule behind non-Jewish cheese? And the Talmud gives no less than 6 reasons as to why the rabbis would have forbade Jewish cheese. Yeah? Well, we'll see. Well, you cannot. Let me go through the reasons first, and you'll decide for yourself. First reason the Talmud gives, and again, we'll see how this applies today as well. But let's just start from the beginning. The first reason the Talmud gives this because it calls it nikur, which is poison, snake poison. There were snakes around in those days, and I guess Jews were more careful about these things. But if you would leave the milk out, then the worry was that a snake would come and drink from that milk and leave behind some poison after it's had its nice, drink. That milk is then used to make cheese, and you end up having poisonous cheese. That was what the rabbis were nervous about, and they said that's why you can't have non-Jewish cheese. Interesting reason. Second reason they give is because they're worried that inside the milk, which was used to make the cheese, there was milk from a non-kosher animal. Because there might be milk from a non-kosher animal over there, you'll have inside this cheese, yes, it's made from cow's milk, but you might have some other milk as well. Camel, horse, donkey potentially. Pig's milk, by the way, is something which was never really drunk. It's quite difficult to milk a pig, and it's just not something which they would ever do. But camel milk was quite popular. You can still buy it in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and they actually do sell it, I believe, here as in a powdered form, if I'm not mistaken, or perhaps it's reconstituted milk. I think you can buy it online. It's about £30 for a litre of milk. That was number 2. So number 1 is poison. Number 2 is the mixture of non-kosher milk. Number 3 is the rennet, which they would use. It's not quite the rennet, actually. Rennet is the milk which is found inside the calf's stomach. The calf drinks from the cow. It's got milk inside its stomach. I don't know how they ever discovered this is how you make cheese. I don't know who the first crazy person was to take milk from inside the calf's stomach, mix it with milk, and then hey ho, you have cheese. But anyway, they used the rennet to do that. Funnily enough, the rennet itself is not such a big deal. They also used to use the skin itself of the stomach of the calf to start that process of the cheese making, and that's going to be a problem of an avela, which is an animal which was not slaughtered properly, and therefore you can't eat that. And that's going to be inside your cheese. Number 3, 4, 5, and 6 are reasons which are interesting, but they used to smear the outside of the cheese with pig fat to give it, I don't know why, I don't know, maybe a nice taste, or it gives it a nice gloss, I don't know. They used to use anyway, there are other reasons as well, no less than 6 reasons. Now, what the Rishonim are then talking about, the medieval sort of halachic decisors are then discussing, is how does this apply today? Now, how does this work in terms of the world we live in today? And the first one, or the ones that really talk about this already on the Gemara itself, is Tosfos. Tosfos, the French the halachic decisors, are discussing, well, today we don't have snakes around. The rabbis were nervous about snakes putting their poison into milk. There are no snakes around today. We don't live in countries where there are snakes, and therefore what would be the problem with eating cheese today? They talk about the fact that the reason which they think is the real reason is obviously there's other reasons as well, but Tosfos sort of talks about the fact that the main reason when we go with is the poison reason. And Tosfos say, you know what, really there is no real reason why to forbid cheese today, because there aren't any snakes around. Although the rabbis made a rule around cheese, they only made that rule for places where there were snakes, and seeing as we live in a country where there aren't any snakes, there shouldn't be too much of an issue with eating that cheese. And indeed, they talk about these chachmei Narvona, where would that be? I don't know, somewhere in Italy. Narbonne, where's that? Italy? France, Italy? Where they actually allowed cheese for this very reason. Now that's just Tosfos himself. Maimonides, the Rambam, says the main reason why they forbade the cheese was because of the rennet issue. And he says, even if you know that this cheese wasn't made in that way, the rabbis made a blanket rule against cheese, and therefore it doesn't matter if you know that you don't have the issue, the law still stands and it makes no difference. And indeed, that is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins, the halacha, that cheese, even if you know, is made with kosher rennet, it still is not allowed if it's made by a non-Jew. It has to be that the Jew is minimally overseeing the process, but according to some, the Jew actually has to be involved in the cheese making process itself. Not good enough to just have a mashgiach there. Interestingly, so that's the cheese issue. One of the things which is clear from this is that when it comes to the rabbinic laws, when it comes to the laws midrabanan, it's not always true to say that because the worry which they had doesn't apply today, therefore we don't have to worry about it ourselves. Sometimes they have what's called a davar shenesar b'minyan, which means something which the Sanhedrin, the High Court, came together and made a decree about, and it's not simple to just get rid of that. You need a beth din, which is greater in number and greater in wisdom, to be able to annul that decree. So even though had Chazal been around today, they perhaps would not have made that same law, given that we don't make the cheese the same way today, potentially. But it doesn't matter. The law still stands, and therefore cheese is something which, come what may, even if you know for a fact that it's not made with this rennet, it's still going to be a problem. That is the cheese story. When it comes to milk, you have an entirely different story over here. And that is because there is quite a different language which the Mishnah uses when it talks about why you can't have non-kosher milk. And the Mishnah says the following. The Mishnah says, the later Mishnah, and Avodah Zarah as well, the Mishnah says, and these are more things which Chazal forbade, which the rabbis forbade. One of those things is milk, which a Jew did not oversee the process of. Milk which was milked by a non-Jew, milk which was milked by a non-Jew, and there is no Jew that's overseeing the process. No Jew that's overseeing the process in terms of the milk making. Now the Gemara then asks, when it comes to milk, what's the problem? What are we worried about? And the Gemara continues and says, when it comes to milk, we're worried about one thing and one thing only, and that is they would potentially mix in milk from a non-kosher animal into the milk from the cow. And by the way, there was a motive for this, because it was cheaper. It was cheaper milk from a camel, or milk from another non-kosher animal. So they would milk it in to scam the fella that was buying it. And therefore, because we can't be sure that this milk is actually purely only milk from a cow, the rabbis came along and said, well, actually, this is not something you can have because we're worried about the milk being mixed in. Now, here's where it gets a bit interesting, and this is where the whole discussion starts when it comes to milk. And that is, it seems from the Rishonim that there is a different attitude that we have towards milk, some Rishonim at least, towards milk, than we have towards cheese. When it came to the cheese, we were saying before that cheese is something which they made a decree about. They made a decree about the cheese, and you cannot eat the cheese come what may. When it comes to the milk, there are some opinions when it comes to the milk which are more lenient than that. And they say that actually this is different to the cheese situation. When it comes to milk, milk isn't something the rabbi said we're making a new rule about and we are forbidding milk in terms of a new rabbinic law. What we're saying is that we are telling you that you need to be aware of this being a problem. That when you buy milk, you need to be sure that you don't have this issue of non-kosher milk being added into this mixture. And therefore, what the question that arises is, what if you are in a country where they just don't milk non-kosher animals? What if you're in a country where you actually don't even have non-kosher animals around which are milked? For example, the Pri Chodesh talks about that. The Pri Chodesh lived in the, I believe, 16th, 17th century Arabic countries where they would definitely not milk animals which weren't kosher. They do drink camel's milk, but he talks about the fact that camel's milk in his time was very expensive, and therefore if we're worried that they're going to scam you, if we're worried they're going to put non-kosher milk into this mixture of kosher milk, then surely you don't have that worry when there is when the camel's milk is so much more expensive. That's not a great way of scamming someone if you're going to end up, costing yourself a lot more. And what he says is fascinating is that milk is very different. Milk doesn't have the same stringency around it as cheese does. And indeed, he actually says that when he went to Amsterdam, he watched the rabbis in Amsterdam, the great rabbis of the time in Amsterdam, drink the milk from non-kosher, not from non-kosher sources, from non-Jewish sources, because they knew, and they knew for a fact that there was no way that this milk came from a kosher animal, from a non-kosher animal.
Can I just interrupt?
Sorry?
Lady Jacobovich said there's no such thing as non-kosher milk. It's unsupervised milk. That's what it should be called, unsupervised. All milk is kosher.
Oh, we'll come to that.
It's all kosher.
We'll come to that. That's just jumping the guns over here, but we'll get there in a second. The Chassam Sofer, who from Hungary, who is known to be quite strict about change. He was fighting very strongly against the reform movement. So for him, anytime you wanted to come up with a change in terms of something we've done, he would push back very strongly against that. He said, absolutely not. This is something which the rabbis forbade. Doesn't matter if you know that there is no non-kosher milk over here. It's absolutely forbidden, even if you know for a fact that there is no non-kosher milk in this mixture. He's not talking about where you watch the process. He's talking about where you haven't seen the milking process, but you know based on other reasons. You know because there's no non-kosher animals around which people are milking. Whatever the reason may be, that is something which cannot be allowed. So you have this debate. This is where it really starts over here in terms of how do we see the milk issue? Is the milk issue something which the rabbis made a blanket rule about, and therefore it doesn't matter if you know that that's not going to be a concern? Still, the rabbis made that rule. It doesn't make a difference. Or no, is it something which the rabbi said you need to be concerned about, but where you don't have that concern, it's going to be okay? And this is the big debate which was going on between the two. And where Rav Moshe Feinstein comes in, which is the major heter which everyone's aware of, which is probably what you're referring to over here, is that he comes up with this fascinating chiddush, comes up with a fascinating new idea, which he believes would work, even according to the Chassam Sofer. Even according to the Chassam Sofer, was quite strict about this. And he says the following. He says what the Mishnah is looking for, what the Gemara says is you need a Jew to be overseeing the process. You need a Jew to watch the milking process. You need to see the guy milking the cow, otherwise it's no good. And what he suggests and what he says is that even if you're going to say that there was a blanket rule which the rabbis made, and it doesn't matter if we know there's no non-kosher milk in the mixture, he suggests that when you have such a strong knowledge about something, when the knowledge is so strong, it's not just because you can make an equation and work it all out, but it's such a strong knowledge that is tantamount to seeing. That was the chiddush that Rav Moshe came up with over here, and that is that because you know that there is no way in their right mind that a company would mix non-kosher milk into the mixture because it is something which they will get heavily fined for. The business will completely collapse if it's ever found out that they've done this without telling people. That the government have strict regulations around what milk you're allowed to put into the mixture. Then that knowledge is so strong that that is called seeing. That is called a Jew seeing the process, which is why probably what you're referring to today, why some would say, and definitely many halachic, not halachic, many of the big kashrus organizations today take on this heter, that because we know with such a strong knowledge that there can't be any non-kosher milk in this mixture, therefore that is called seeing it. It's an important thing to recognize because what Ramosh is essentially saying is that even those that say it's a blanket rule will agree. Even the Chasam Sofer will agree that this is something which is such a strong knowledge that it's seeing. Before Rav Moshe came along, you would say, well, this only would work according to the Pri Chadash. This would only work if you say that it's something which is not a blanket rule, that it's something which doesn't apply when you don't have the concern. But what Rav Moshe is suggesting is, even if it was a blanket rule, even if you don't have to be concerned when you have such a strong knowledge, it would be okay. And he calls it actually Chalav Yisrael. It's Jewish milk. Why? Because it's something which a Jew has seen, even though not physically with your own eyes, but it's something which you've actually seen. He does say that it's better to be better if one can, to be stringent. I guess where that's coming from. I guess he doesn't want to tamper with it to that degree. What Jews have been doing for centuries, millennia. But bottom line is that he says there's no problem with it whatsoever, and that is because it's something which a Jew has overseen. So that's a very brief overview of this entire topic. There's of course more to it as well, but I think the two main ideas which I wanted to get across is that sometimes you have with rabbinic laws things which, come what may, we have to stick to even though the concern doesn't apply. For example, bishul akum, a non-Jew cooking something. The reason behind that rule was so that they would prevent intermarriage. You'd eat a nice dish which the chef has made for you. You develop a close relationship with that chef. The chef has a lovely daughter which he introduces to you, and before you know it, you're marrying the fellow's daughter. That is why they prevented non-Jewish cooking. Now the Shulchan Aruch, the Nosei Kelim around it, talk about what about a priest who, in theory, doesn't have any children, doesn't have a daughter. Why can't you eat the priest's food? And the answer is because they made a blanket rule. There were no exceptions. They didn't make exceptions to the rules. A bit like driving down the street at 3 a.m. and there's a pedestrian crossing and the light goes red for people to cross the road, and there isn't a human being in sight. So what's the big deal? Why can't I go through the red light? It's not dangerous. It's 3 a.m. There's no one around. I can see there's no one around. Well, the answer is there are no exceptions to this rule. And you will get fined by the police if they see, and you will get points in your license to go through that red light, even though you know it's not dangerous right now, because that's the nature of the law. If you're going to start making exceptions, then the law itself is not going to be strong enough. But you do have other instances, like you see in Tosfos, where Tosfos understood that Chazal only made this law where there was a concern about snakes. Well, there's no concern about snakes when it comes to the cheese. There is no law. So in each one of the rabbinic laws, one needs to be able to investigate carefully to understand, is this something they made as a blanket rule? Doesn't matter if you know that the concern doesn't apply. Or perhaps they didn't make it as a blanket rule, and where the concern doesn't apply, the rule doesn't stand, and that's where this whole discussion comes from in terms of non-Jewish milk and cheese. And I think we can take questions, but I don't know what time I'm meant to finish. Okay, fine. Yeah, and that's true, and there are those that for those on Zoom, the question was, we do definitely see that companies have been unscrupulous, I guess, in terms of the way they sell their products. There was a case in Tesco, I think a few years ago, where they were selling horse meat. I don't think Tesco knew about this. I think it was the supplier that was supplying them with horse meat in their ham, and that caused a big uproar. And there was a lot in the press about that. So yeah, it's true. We do find cases of companies that will take the risk, and therefore, who's to say that that is good enough in terms of seeing? I hear that. I do hear that point.
Okay.
What do you mean trace it? How? Okay. Yeah. That's, yeah.
Program the other morning on TV.
Yeah.
Milking a cow.
Yeah.
Delivering.
Yeah.
Milk. Antibiotics.
Yeah.
Like the delivery. And then before milk comes, you're allowed to go into
Yeah. Well, that's where Moshe's sort of heta is coming from. That strong knowledge is what he would call Jews overseeing the process, even though you don't have a mashgiach there watching. The fact that we can know all of this is what creates a situation whereby it's tantamount to someone being there watching it. Not everyone agrees, but it's sort of taken on as that is the attitude that we have nowadays towards milk, although you'll find that many people are quite strict about not drinking the milk. I don't think it comes from the fact that they believe that it's, as you said before, non-kosher. There is just an extra stringency that we have about Chalav Yisrael, but you're hard pressed to find someone that actually believes it's non-kosher milk. It's just as a chumrah, it's a stringency that people have. Yeah. Okay.
Where the cows get milk. It's completely automatic. The cows know when it's time to be milked.
Yeah.
They walk themselves into the area.
Yeah.
They go into an area. First of all, the machine comes down and it spritzes water on them.
And
then it spritzes disinfectant.
And
then it actually suckers to the teeth.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to watch this.
Yeah.
The cow walks out and
goes
to where it goes. The whole thing is automatic. There was not a person in there other than us watching.
Amazing. I was still by the 3 or 4 weeks.
Was it?
Yes.
Well, on that point, I was reading recently that they're going to abolish the need to have a self-ID on milk because it's something you can just know yourself. So much milk is thrown away. Yeah, exactly. So you don't need a self-ID on milk. You just sell it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I pass that bowl round? Very much for
Pleasure.
Akiva for joining us this morning. Topical talk. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
See you next week.